I am Nia, 32 years old, and the undeniable black sheep of my family. At my younger sister's lavish wedding, I was handed a crumpled paper bag that read "Limited Access Guest." My mother whispered that my presence would embarrass her new wealthy in-laws, so I had to eat a sandwich in my car. I simply looked at her, walked straight to the glittering gift table, retrieved my envelope containing a $10,000 check, and told my sister she would not be needing it anymore. As I turned to leave, my sister ran after me screaming while her new groom physically blocked the exit doors. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the Washington household meant keeping up appearances at all absolute costs. My mother Vivian was the ultimate church matriarch. To her, our family image was a fragile glass sculpture that had to be polished daily. My younger sister Jada was the golden child who could do no wrong, perfectly conforming to every expectation. I was the exact opposite. I was independent, outspoken, and immune to the social climbing my parents valued above all else. They saw my drive as rebellion and my independence as a direct insult to their authority. For years, I endured their passive-aggressive comments about my life choices. They told everyone I was just a lowly caterer who cleaned up after rich people. They had no idea I had built a luxury hospitality empire from the ground up. I kept my wealth entirely hidden because I knew exactly how they would exploit it. Jada's wedding to Preston was supposed to be the ultimate elevation of the Washington family bloodline. Preston came from what he claimed was old money Nantucket. My parents mortgaged their entire lives to pay for a $150,000 wedding at the Bellevue estate just to impress his family. I arrived at the venue wearing an understated but expensive emerald silk dress. I wanted to support my sister despite our differences. But the moment I stepped through the grand oak doors of the estate, my mother intercepted me. Vivian grabbed my wrist with a grip so tight her manicured nails dug into my skin. She aggressively pulled me away from the entryway and shoved me into a dark alcove near the kitchen swinging doors. Before I could ask what was going on, she shoved a cheap crumpled brown paper bag into my chest. Written across the front in thick black permanent marker were the words, "Limited Access Guest." I stared at the bag and then up at my mother. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure elitist panic. She leaned in close, her voice a vicious hiss. "That means you do not have a plate for dinner tonight, Nia. Preston's family is old money. They are true high society. They paid for half of this wedding, and we cannot have a mere caterer sitting at the main tables making us look ghetto. You need to take this bag of snacks and go eat in your car. We will text you when it is time to come to the back for the family photos. Do not cause a scene and ruin this for your sister." For a moment, the sheer audacity of her words hung in the air between us. My mother was banishing me to a parking lot because she was ashamed of the profession she wrongly assumed I had. 10 years ago, that kind of rejection would have sent me running to my car in tears. I would have internalized the shame and wondered why I was never good enough to sit at their table. But the woman standing in front of Vivian now was not a scared little girl. I was a self-made millionaire who actually owned the management company that operated the very estate she was standing in. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply looked her dead in the eye and let a slow, cold smirk spread across my face. I dropped the brown paper bag onto the pristine marble floor. Then I turned my back on her and walked straight past the kitchen alcove directly into the glittering grand ballroom. Vivian gasped and called my name in a harsh whisper but could not scream without drawing attention. I strode through the sea of tuxedoed men and women in evening gowns. The room was dripping in crystal chandeliers and towering floral arrangements. I ignored the stares of my extended family members, who knew I was supposed to be hidden away. I walked with absolute purpose until I reached the massive gift table at the center of the room. It was piled high with wrapped boxes and elegant cards. I sifted through the towering pile of envelopes until I found the one I had placed there earlier. It was a thick, gold-embossed envelope with Jada and Preston's names written in calligraphy. I ripped it open right there in the middle of the ballroom. Jada saw me from across the room. She gathered up her massive layers of white tulle and rushed over. Her face was flushed with anger. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded. "Mom told you to wait outside. You are going to embarrass Preston in front of his parents." I reached into the envelope and pulled out the cashier's check. It was for $10,000. "Since I am a limited access guest, you will not need this," I said, ripping it, dropping the pieces, and walking toward the exit. Jada screamed, begging for the money. Suddenly, Preston stepped out, physically blocking the grand double doors. His face was red with rage. "Where do you think you are going?" he demanded. I smiled. My revenge was just truly beginning. The ballroom spun into a dizzying vortex of absolute chaos. You could practically feel the collective panic rippling through the room as the tuxedoed waitstaff silently marched out the double doors, taking the silver platters of lobster, the crystal bowls of caviar, and every drop of top-shelf champagne with them. The string quartet had abruptly stopped playing mid-note, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. High society guests from Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard clutched their pearls, their mouths hanging open in perfectly synchronized horror. The visual of the towering five-tier wedding cake being wheeled backward into the kitchen was the final nail in the coffin of my family's fabricated high-class illusion. The silence did not last long. A sharp, stinging crack echoed through the cavernous ballroom, loud enough to make the front row of guests physically jump. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the impact. The sting of my mother's palm burned across my left cheek. Vivian stood before me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a frantic, unhinged terror. She had completely lost her carefully curated church matriarch persona. Her perfectly styled hair was trembling as she raised her hand, looking as though she wanted to strike me a second time. "You are ruining us!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure venom. "You are destroying everything we have built." This was our chance, Nia. This was our chance to elevate this family, to mix our bloodline with real prestige. And you bring your ghetto blue-collar vendettas into this sacred room just to spite me. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not rub my cheek. I did not shed a single tear. I just stared at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical pity. She was trembling over the loss of a social status she never actually possessed. Before I could even process the tragic irony of her words, Jada pushed past our mother. My sister was a vision of bridal hysteria. Tears streamed down her face, leaving thick black tracks of expensive mascara ruining her flawless makeup. She grabbed handfuls of her custom silk gown, stomping her feet like a toddler throwing a tantrum in a toy aisle. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter spinster!" Jada sobbed hysterically, pointing a trembling manicured finger right at my face. "You could not stand to see me get the fairy tale. You could not stand that I found a man with real wealth, real class, someone who would never look twice at a miserable, lonely caterer like you. You want me to be as miserable and alone as you are. You are dead to me, Nia. Do you hear me, dead?" I looked at my sister, watching her absolutely unravel over a fraudulent fairy tale. I wanted to ask her how much wealth and class her new husband really had, if his credit cards were bouncing all over the city, but I let her scream. I let her expose the shallow, hollow core of her character for every single guest to witness. The drama was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, condescending voice cutting through the heavy air. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Preston." The crowd parted as Preston's mother stepped forward. She was a haughty, severe-looking white woman dripping in an offensive amount of rented diamond jewelry. She looked my mother up and down as if she had just stepped in something foul on the sidewalk. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was laced with a quiet, lethal disgust. "I told my son that mixing with your kind would bring nothing but humiliation." She sneered, her gaze sweeping over my parents and Jada. "We welcomed you into our circle, and this is how you repay us. You bring your domestic squabbles into a public venue like a pack of uncivilized thugs. You people have absolutely no class, no breeding, and no respect." The racial and classist undertones of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was the moment. This was the moment any self-respecting mother would step up, defend her family, and kick this arrogant woman out of the room. This was the moment Vivian Washington should have found her pride. Instead, I watched my mother commit the ultimate betrayal. Vivian did not defend herself. She did not defend Jada. She completely folded. My mother physically shrank her shoulders, hunching forward as she stepped toward Preston's mother with her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate submission. "I am so incredibly sorry, Mrs. Carmichael." Vivian pleaded, her voice trembling with tears of humiliation. "Please, I beg you, do not judge our family by her actions." She pointed a shaking finger at me, throwing her own flesh and blood directly under the bus to appease a woman who had just called her a thug. Nia has always been the problem. She has always been jealous and disruptive. We are so deeply ashamed of her behavior. Please let us fix this. Let us make this right for Preston and your beautiful family. It was the most pathetic display of groveling I had ever witnessed in my entire life. My mother was literally bowing to whiteness and perceived wealth, apologizing for her own existence just to keep a seat at a table that was actively rejecting her. She would rather sacrifice her own daughter than lose her proximity to power. Preston's mother sniffed dismissively, turning her nose up at Vivian's apology. "I think the damage is already done," she said coldly. But before Vivian could drop to her knees and beg any further, the heavy brass handles of the venue doors turned with a loud metallic clank. The massive wooden doors burst open, hitting the walls with a thunderous thud that echoed through the silent ballroom. Everyone turned, expecting to see the venue manager or the wedding planner coming to resolve the catering dispute. It was not the wedding planner. 3 uniformed police officers strode into the glittering room. The heavy clomp of their tactical boots against the polished marble floor felt like a drumbeat. The room collectively held its breath. My father, Jerome, immediately stepped backward, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, assuming they were here because of the scene I had caused or the debts he owed. Vivian gasped, clutching her chest as she looked at me, her eyes screaming that this was somehow my fault. But the officers did not look at me. They did not look at my father. They bypassed the Washington family entirely. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern, uncompromising expression, walked straight through the crowd of horrified elite guests. He marched directly up to the altar steps, his eyes locked onto the groom. "Preston Carmichael." The officer's voice boomed across the ballroom, commanding absolute authority. "Step away from the bride and keep your hands where I can see them." I take a slow, measured sip of my bourbon, the crystal glass cool against my lips, as I recall the exact moment the color drained from Preston's perfectly tanned face. He froze on the altar, his hands instinctively rising into the air, surrendering before the officers even had to repeat their command. The grand ballroom plunged into a deafening, suffocating silence. Every single guest, from the Nantucket elite to my socially climbing relatives, stood completely paralyzed, their champagne glasses suspended mid-air. The lead police officer, a towering man with a voice that demanded absolute compliance, pulled a folded warrant from his tactical vest. "Preston Carmichael, you are under arrest for grand larceny and felony fraud," the officer announced, his words carrying to the very back of the room. "You have issued multiple fraudulent checks to the Bellevue Estate Management for the amount of $150,000. We also have active warrants for wire fraud connected to 3 other shell companies registered in your name. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Preston did not remain silent. He immediately panicked, the sophisticated old money facade shattering into a million pathetic pieces. He pointed a shaking, manicured finger straight at my father. Jerome was standing frozen near the dance floor, his jaw practically unhinged. "It was not me!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I did not write those checks. My father-in-law told me he was covering the entire venue cost. He told me he had the money. He set me up. He instructed me to sign the venue contract under my holding company to secure the date, but he promised to wire the funds. This is a mistake." Every head in the room swiveled toward my father. Jerome started sweating profusely. Thick drops of perspiration gathered on his forehead, rolling down his temples and soaking the crisp white collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo. His pristine image, the very thing he worshipped above his own children, was being dismantled in front of the exact high society people he had mortgaged his entire life to impress. He stepped forward, waving his hands frantically, his voice booming in a desperate bid to save his manufactured status. "Officers, please, there is a massive misunderstanding here," Jerome declared loudly, forcing a terrible, unconvincing laugh. "I am a respected businessman in this community. I have stellar credit and standing. This is just a banking error, a simple clerical delay. I will handle this right now. I will write a new check to the venue and the police department right this second. We are upstanding citizens. I can clear this $150,000 balance right here on the spot, and we can all go back to celebrating my daughter's beautiful union." He ripped a leather checkbook from his breast pocket, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his gold-plated pen. The lead officer looked at him with absolute unyielding pity. "Sir, you cannot write a check to the police department to make a felony disappear," the officer stated flatly. "Furthermore, the management of this estate has already pressed formal charges. The venue debt is no longer held by the Bellevue estate. It was legally purchased by a third party holding firm this morning." That was my cue. I stepped out from the bewildered crowd, my emerald silk dress catching the light of the chandeliers as I walked calmly toward the altar. I pulled my sleek tablet from my clutch. I tapped the screen once, bringing up the digital deed and the heavily encrypted financial transfer records. I turned the glowing screen toward the officers and then toward my sweating, frantic father. "The debt has already been purchased," I announced, my voice cutting through the silent room like a sharpened blade. "And the management company that initiated the charges is Elite Estates Hospitality, which I own in its entirety. I bought your fraudulent debt at exactly 9 o'clock this morning, Dad. You do not owe the venue anymore. You owe me." Jerome refused to believe it. His mind simply could not process that the daughter he had hidden away in a corner was the very person holding his financial execution order. He pulled out his platinum credit cards, shoving them toward the venue manager, who had just walked in behind the police line. "Charge these," my father demanded, his voice thick with rising panic and utter denial. "Charge all of them right now. I am not in debt to my disrespectful daughter. Run the cards." The venue manager pulled out a mobile payment terminal with a solemn expression. He swiped the first platinum card. Declined. He swiped the second card. Declined. He swiped a third, a fourth, a fifth. Every single account was maxed out, frozen, or entirely empty. The machine beeped a harsh, repetitive red warning that echoed through the painfully quiet room. Jada finally realized the gravity of the situation. Her perfect wedding, her perfect groom, and her perfect wealthy lifestyle were all a complete fabrication. She collapsed onto the marble steps of the altar. Her massive white gown billowed around her like a deflated parachute. She began sobbing hysterically, tearing at her veil and screaming at the top of her lungs. "Nia, you have to pay this," she shrieked, pointing at me while her face contorted in agony. "You have millions of dollars. You just said you own the company. Pay for it. Bail him out right now. You cannot let them take my husband away on our wedding day. You owe this family. You are ruining my life." I looked down at my sister sobbing uncontrollably on the floor in her ruined makeup. Then I looked at my mother, Vivian, who was hiding her face behind her trembling hands in absolute soul-crushing shame. Finally, I looked at my father, who was staring at his stack of declined credit cards as if they had physically stabbed him. I slid my tablet back into my clutch, my expression perfectly neutral. "I owe this family absolutely nothing," I said. My voice was calm, remarkably steady, and completely devoid of any pity. "You made it very clear at the door tonight that I am just a limited access guest. And limited access guests do not pay for the main event." The police officers grabbed Preston by the arms, spinning him around forcefully. They pulled his arms behind his back, the sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut, echoing loudly over Jada's continuous wailing. Preston Carmichael, the supposed heir to a massive Nantucket fortune, was dragged out of his own lavish wedding reception in handcuffs, weeping like a child. He was paraded past the horrified stares of the genuine high society guests, leaving my family drowning in the exact public humiliation they had spent their entire miserable lives trying to avoid. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my penthouse, casting sharp, unyielding shadows across the imported hardwood. I was standing at my kitchen island barefoot in a silk robe grinding fresh espresso beans when the private elevator chimed. I had authorized my building security to let them up. I wanted this confrontation to happen entirely on my turf. The heavy steel doors slid open, and the absolute chaos of the Washington family spilled into my quiet sanctuary. The steady rhythm of my morning felt instantly disrupted by their erratic, frantic energy, like a handheld camera shaking violently trying to capture a collapsing building. My father, Jerome, stepped out of the elevator first, looking 10 years older than he had at the altar. His tuxedo shirt from the night before was violently rumpled, his bow tie hanging loosely around his neck, and his posture was entirely stripped of its usual arrogant puff. Vivian trailed closely behind him, her eyes darting wildly around my living room. I watched her take in the sweeping million-dollar views of the city skyline, the custom velvet furniture, the priceless original art on the walls. It was the undeniable, irrefutable proof of my wealth, and watching the realization hit her was utterly intoxicating. Her jaw tightened so hard I thought her teeth might crack. Jada pushed past our parents, her eyes red and violently swollen, still clutching a piece of her torn wedding veil in her fist, like a child holding a security blanket. And finally bringing up the rear was Trey. My older brother, the undisputed golden boy of the family, the son who had never worked a hard day in his life, but somehow received every ounce of praise and resources my parents had to offer. Jada did not waste a single second taking in the scenery. She marched right up to my marble island, slamming her hands flat against the cool stone. "You need to get him out!" she shrieked, her voice echoing aggressively off the high ceilings. "You need to call your high-priced lawyers and fix this right now. Preston is sitting in a holding cell like a common criminal. Do you have any idea what this is doing to his reputation? To our family's reputation?" I simply pressed the button on my espresso machine, letting the loud, grinding hum drown out her hysteria for a few glorious seconds. When the machine stopped, I picked up my mug, inhaling the rich aroma. "His reputation," I replied smoothly, taking a slow sip. "He wrote fraudulent checks to my company, Jada. He is a criminal. He does not have a reputation to protect anymore." Jerome slammed his fist against the wall, trying desperately to reclaim the patriarchal authority he had completely lost the night before. "Do not speak to your sister that way in front of me," he barked, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "You humiliated this family on purpose. You sat back and let us look like absolute fools. You clearly have limitless resources, Nia. Look at this place. You have been hiding all this money while your own family struggled and scraped to elevate our social standing. You are going to call the police, you are going to post Preston's bail this morning, and you are going to drop those ridiculous fraud charges today." Trey crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up as he glared at me from across the kitchen. "You heard Dad," he sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space to try and intimidate me. "Stop acting like a bitter, jealous brat and do your duty to this family. You write that check right now and fix this mess, or you are dead to all of us." Then Vivian stepped forward, utilizing the ultimate weapon she had wielded against me since early childhood. Pure weaponized guilt. She placed a trembling hand over her heart, conjuring crocodile tears with expert precision. "Nia, please," she sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "You do not understand the gravity of what you are doing to us. We did not just use our savings for this wedding. We mortgaged the family home, the house your grandparents built with their bare hands from the ground up." She took a step closer, grabbing the edge of the marble island. "We took out a massive high-risk loan against the property to give Jada a $150,000 wedding because we had to impress Preston's family. We had to show them we belonged in their circle. If you do not pay his bail, if you let him go to prison and his parents cut ties with us, we will be completely ruined. We cannot afford the monthly payments on that loan, Nia. If Preston goes down, we lose the house. You will be directly responsible for making your own parents homeless. I looked at the four of them. My family. The people who had shoved me into a dark kitchen hallway and handed me a brown paper bag just 24 hours ago, demanding I eat in my car to protect their precious image. Now they were standing in my penthouse demanding my money to save a fraudulent white man and a house they could not even afford. I set my coffee mug down on the island. The ceramic clink sounded like a judge's gavel bringing the courtroom to order. I opened the top drawer of the island and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bonded paper. I walked around the island and stopped directly in front of my father. I held the papers out. Jerome hesitated, wiping sweat from his upper lip before snatching them from my hand. "Read the first page, Dad," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Read it out loud." He fumbled in his pocket for his reading glasses, sliding them onto his face as his eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. "You did not mortgage the grandparents' house to a traditional bank, did you?" I asked, stepping closer, refusing to let him look away from the pages. "You could not go to a real bank. Your credit was completely destroyed. You went through a high-interest private shell lender because you were desperate for quick cash to fund an absolute lie." Jerome's eyes widened in sheer terror. His breathing hitched as he read the bold print at the very top of the contract. Vivian looked back and forth between us, blind panic rising in her throat. "What does it say, Jerome?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "What does it say?" Jerome slowly lowered the papers, his hands trembling so violently the pages rustled loudly against each other. The color entirely vanished from his face, leaving him looking hollow and defeated. "Look at the name of the holding company that issued your loan," I said, a dark, victorious smile finally playing on my lips. Jerome dropped the papers to the floor as if they had physically burned his hands. The heavy stack hit the hardwood with a definitive thud. "I own the holding company, Dad," I whispered, watching his entire world collapse in real time. "I own the mortgage. You do not owe a bank. You owe the limited access guest." I turned my back on my father's shattered expression and began a slow, deliberate walk across the vast expanse of my penthouse. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, casting sharp, unyielding shadows across the imported hardwood. Down below, the morning traffic of the city crawled in neat, orderly lines, a picture of perfect control that stood in sharp contrast to the absolute wreckage of the Washington family happening in my living room. I looked down at the tiny cars, savoring the profound silence that had temporarily paralyzed my parents. The heavy quiet was broken by the sound of expensive leather shoes stepping right over the scattered mortgage documents. Trey. My older brother had always believed his own hype. He was the undisputed golden child, the one who could do absolutely no wrong, the son who had his failures scrubbed clean by our parents' relentless enabling. He marched across the room, closing the distance between us until he was standing just inches from my back. I turned around to face him. He tried to use his height to intimidate me, looming over me with his jaw set in a hard, angry line, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of manufactured dominance. "You think this is a game?" Nia Trey sneered, his breath hot and reeking of stale champagne from the night before. "You think you can just buy our parents' house and hold it over our heads like some kind of dictator? You are going to sign that deed over to me right now. I am the man of this family and I am taking control of this situation. You are going to transfer the property into my name and I will handle the bank, the police, and Preston." I did not step back. I simply tilted my head, studying him like a fascinating insect trapped in a jar. "The man of the family," I repeated, letting the words drip with pure, concentrated sarcasm. "You live in a luxury downtown condo paid for by Dad. You drive a sports car leased entirely in Mom's name, and you have not held down a legitimate job since you barely graduated college. You are not a man, Trey. You are a highly subsidized dependent throwing a temper tantrum." Trey's face flushed a deep, violent purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his rumpled collar, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You shut your mouth," he snapped, his voice rising to a frantic, erratic pitch. "You do not know anything about my business deals. Preston and I had an arrangement. I brought him into this family. I introduced him to Jada. He promised me a 30% cut of the Washington family wealth once they tied the knot and consolidated their assets. He said his Nantucket trust fund was going to clear by Friday, and I was supposed to get a massive payout for setting the whole thing up and keeping Dad off his back. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. The entire room stopped breathing. Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in utter shock. Jada looked up from the floor, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "You sold me out," Jada whispered, her voice cracking as the ultimate betrayal washed over her. "You set me up with a con artist for a payout. You practically sold me to a criminal." Trey suddenly realized what he had just confessed out loud. He stammered frantically, trying to backpedal, his eyes darting around the penthouse looking for an escape route that did not exist. "No, Jada, that is not what I meant." He showed me bank statements. He showed me the trust fund documents. I thought he was completely legitimate. I was just trying to secure a future for all of us. I was being a businessman. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that cut right through his pathetic excuses. "He showed you forged documents, Trey," I said, walking back toward the kitchen island. "Because game recognizes game. You did not just introduce them. You did not just act as the greedy middleman trying to auction off your own sister for a cut of imaginary wealth." I opened the second drawer of the marble island and pulled out a thin manila folder. When I realized I was purchasing the fraudulent debt for the Bellevue estate, I naturally had my security and legal team run a full comprehensive background check on everyone involved in the transaction. I explained, tossing the folder onto the counter with a loud smack. I ran a check on Preston, which took all of 5 minutes to expose his fraudulent shell companies. But then, just to be thorough, I ran a background check on you. Trey began to step backward, his face draining of all color. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. "You did not just introduce them, Trey," I stated, my voice echoing with a lethal, terrifying calm. "You actively financed this entire fraudulent wedding. But since you have absolutely zero credit and no verifiable income, you needed a co-signer. You needed someone with a pristine financial record to secure the loans for the luxury catering, the imported floral arrangements, and the string quartet." Vivian looked at her golden boy, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrific realization. "Trey, what did you do?" she whispered. "You used my social security number, Trey," I declared, locking eyes with him. "You stole my identity. You forged my signature on over $70,000 worth of high-interest unsecured wedding loans. You thought because I was just a lowly caterer, I would never notice the hard credit inquiries until it was too late. You thought Preston's fake trust fund would clear you, would pay off the loans, take your 30% cut, and I would never be the wiser." "You witch!" Trey screamed, the last shred of his golden boy persona violently tearing away. He lunged forward, his hands outstretched like claws aiming directly for my throat. He was entirely unhinged, acting on pure desperate adrenaline as the reality of federal identity theft charges crashed down on him. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. Before his hands could come anywhere near me, 2 massive figures stepped out from the shadowed hallway leading to my private office, my personal security detail. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. One guard grabbed Trey by the collar of his ruined tuxedo shirt, hauling him backward, while the other swept his legs completely out from under him. The impact of Trey hitting the hardwood floor rattled the expensive crystal glasses sitting on the kitchen counter. The guard pressed his knee firmly between Trey's shoulder blades, pinning him entirely flat against the ground. Trey gasped for air, his cheek pressed hard against the imported wood. His arms twisted and pinned painfully behind his back. He thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities, but the guards held him down with effortless strength. I slowly picked up my coffee mug, taking another measured sip, as I looked down at the man of the family. From the vantage point of the sleek black dome, security cameras tucked into the high corners of my ceiling, the scene below must have looked like a Renaissance painting of a fallen empire. I could picture the wide-angle view on the monitors in the security room, the sprawling sun-drenched penthouse, the imported Italian marble island, and sprawled flat across the polished hardwood, the golden child of the Washington family pinned down by two men twice his size. It was a perfectly framed portrait of absolute powerlessness. Trey thrashed his head side to side, his cheeks squeaking against the wood floor. "Dad, do something!" Trey yelled, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Tell them to get off me. She cannot do this." But Jerome did not move a single muscle. My father simply stared at the floor, completely paralyzed by the realization that his pristine credit, his social standing, and his entire financial future were permanently obliterated. I pulled my cell phone from the pocket of my silk robe. I did not call the local precinct. I directly dialed the lead fraud detective who had arrested Preston the night before. I had memorized his extension. Detective Miller. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I have the primary co-conspirator for the Carmichael fraud currently detained at my residence." "Yes." "Identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny. My brother Trey Washington. Send a unit up to the penthouse." The moment I ended the call, Vivian snapped, the meticulously crafted high society church matriarch persona completely fractured. She dropped to her knees right there in my kitchen. The expensive fabric of her designer skirt pooled around her on the floor. She threw her hands up toward the ceiling, tears streaming down her face as she began to wail. It was a loud, guttural sound invoking the Lord and the church, a theatrical performance of maternal desperation. "Lord Jesus, please!" Vivian screamed, rocking back and forth on her knees. "Nia, I am begging you, stop this right now. Hang up the phone. You are sending your own black brother to the system. You know what they do to our men in there. You are throwing your own flesh and blood into a cage for a white man's mistake." I slowly lowered my phone. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air, toxic and suffocating. She was actually trying to weaponize our race, trying to invoke the very real systemic injustices of the world to shield her spoiled criminal son from the consequences of stealing from his own sister. I stepped around the kitchen island, walking until I stood directly over my mother. I looked down at her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. "A white man's mistake," I repeated, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like glass. "You literally shoved me into a dark kitchen hallway yesterday to worship that white man. You handed me a crumpled brown paper bag and banished me to a parking lot because you were so desperate to bow down to his imaginary Nantucket money. You sold your soul to impress him. But now that the bill is due suddenly, it is a racial tragedy. Suddenly you want to play the race card and preach about protecting the black family unit to save the son who stole from me." Vivian choked on a sob, shaking her head frantically. "He made a mistake, Nia. He was just trying to help Jada. He was trying to secure our future. He did not mean to hurt you." "He did not mean to hurt me," I echoed, letting a dark, hollow laugh escape my chest. "You think I just found out about this today, Vivian? When Elite Estates Hospitality purchased the venue debt, my legal team ran a comprehensive forensic audit on every single signature attached to those loans. You do not just steal a person's social security number and forge their name on $70,000 of high-interest debt by accident." Trey stopped struggling against the guards. He lay perfectly still on the floor, his breathing ragged. "I hired the best private investigators in the city." I continued, my eyes never leaving my mother's face. "They subpoenaed the digital footprint of the loan applications. They pulled the metadata. And they pulled the audio files attached to Trey's cloud storage. Because Trey is arrogant, but he is also incredibly stupid. I unlocked my phone and opened an audio file my legal team had extracted and sent to me a week ago. I turned the volume all the way up. "You want to talk about family loyalty, Mom?" I asked softly. "Let us talk about it." I pressed play. The audio was crisp and clear, recorded just 2 months prior. It was Vivian's voice, the unmistakable sharp tone of my mother echoing loudly through the silent penthouse. "Trey just traced the signature from that old birthday card she sent us," Vivian's recorded voice commanded through the phone speaker. "It does not have to be perfect. These private lenders do not care as long as the background check clears. Just put her social security number down on the guarantor line." There was a pause on the recording, followed by Trey's muffled voice asking what would happen if I tried to buy a car or a house and saw the credit inquiry. Who cares? Vivian's recorded voice snapped back with vicious casual cruelty. Naya has no husband, she doesn't need credit. She is just a caterer, Trey. She will never even know. Just sign the paper so your sister can have her dream wedding. I paused the audio. The silence that followed was absolute. Jada, who had been standing frozen by the elevator, let out a sharp gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands, staring at her mother in pure horror. Even Jada, in all her spoiled, selfish vanity, could not fathom the depth of this betrayal. Our mother had actively coached her golden boy on exactly how to commit federal identity theft against her own daughter. Vivian's mouth opened, but no words came out. The tears on her cheeks seemed to instantly dry up. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an excuse, a justification, a lie. But there was nowhere left to hide. The mask was completely gone, leaving only the ugly, undeniable truth exposed in the harsh morning light. "You threw me away a long time ago, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You decided I was worthless because I did not fit your shallow, pathetic narrative of success. You thought I was a nobody. You thought I was a victim. But while you were all busy tearing me down and plotting to steal my future, I was busy buying yours." The chime of the private elevator echoed through the penthouse, signaling the arrival of the police. The doors slid open, and two uniformed officers stepped into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. I did not even look at the officers. I kept my eyes locked on my mother as she kneeled on the floor of the empire I built. "Officers," I said clearly. "The man on the floor is Trey Washington. He is ready for transport." The polished gold cross mounted on the back wall of the sanctuary caught the morning sunlight, gleaming with a heavy, oppressive authority. The camera focus shifted, blurring the ornate religious symbol until the sharp, unbothered lines of my face came into perfect clarity. I was sitting in the third pew, my legs elegantly crossed in a tailored cream suit, nursing a soft, knowing smile. It was Sunday morning at Grace Temple Ministries, the absolute epicenter of Vivian Washington's social universe. For 20 years, this sanctuary was her stage, her kingdom, the place where she wore her oversized designer hats and judged everyone else from the comfort of the front row. Today, she was treating the packed congregation to the performance of a lifetime. Vivian stood at the microphone, clutching the wooden edges of the podium as if she might collapse from the sheer weight of her manufactured sorrow. She had requested a special testimony period from the church elders. The organist played a soft, mournful chord in the background to set the mood. Vivian dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "The devil has launched a coordinated attack on my home," she cried out, her voice trembling with expert precision. "My own flesh and blood has been corrupted by the wicked snare of greed. My daughter Nia has let worldly wealth poison her soul. She has turned her back on the very family that raised her. She threw her own brother, her beautiful, innocent brother Trey, to the merciless justice system. She is holding our family home hostage, threatening to put her own father on the street." Gasps and sympathetic murmurs rippled through the packed pews. Hundreds of judgmental eyes darted toward me. Women in their Sunday best shook their heads in profound disappointment, whispering to one another behind their church programs. Jada sat in the front row, playing the role of the traumatized bride, leaning her head on Jerome's shoulder while he tried to look stoic and betrayed. They thought this public ambush would break me. They thought bringing me into the house of God and weaponizing the entire congregation against me would force my hand. They expected me to shrink, to break down in tears, to beg for their forgiveness, to avoid being cast out of the community they ruled. Pastor Gregory stepped up to the microphone, gently placing a comforting hand on Vivian's shoulder as she openly wept. He was a man who loved the sound of his own preaching and deeply respected the hefty tithes my father supposedly contributed to the church. Pastor Gregory adjusted his tailored suit jacket and looked directly at me. His gaze was heavy with pastoral disappointment and righteous authority. "Sister Nia, the Lord commands us to release the debts of our brethren." Pastor Gregory began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Scripture tells us that holding on to vengeance only robs us of our own salvation. How can you sit in the house of the Lord with such a hardened heart? Your family is bleeding. Will you let pride and money destroy your eternal soul? I am calling on you right now in front of your spiritual family to walk down this aisle, forgive your parents, drop these worldly charges against your brother, and release this toxic debt. Choose grace, Sister Nia. Show us that the devil has not won your heart. The entire sanctuary went dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents over the heavy breathing of the crowd. Everyone waited for the prodigal daughter to break. I did not break. I did not yell, scream, or try to defend myself from my seat. I slowly uncrossed my legs, stood up, and smoothed the pristine fabric of my skirt. I picked up a thick black leather binder from the pew beside me. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the floorboards was the only sound in the cavernous room as I walked down the center aisle with absolute terrifying purpose. Vivian visibly smirked, lowering her handkerchief. She thought the public pressure had crushed my resolve. She thought she had shamed me into submission. Jerome sat up straighter, adjusting his tie, looking entirely triumphant. I reached the altar, completely bypassing my family in the front row. I walked directly up the carpeted steps and stood right next to Pastor Gregory at the pulpit. I did not reach for the microphone. I simply opened the heavy leather binder and laid it flat across his open Bible. I will gladly release their debts. Pastor, I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough for the choir and the front rows to hear over the dead silence. As soon as they release yours. Pastor Gregory looked down at the documents, his brow furrowing in confusion. What is this? He asked, his voice immediately losing its booming theatrical authority. It is a forensic accounting ledger, I replied, maintaining my calm, steady tone as I tapped the top page. When my security team investigated Preston Carmichael and my brother, we had to track every single fraudulent wire transfer to build our case. My father was desperate to fund Preston's fake old money lifestyle to keep up appearances and secure the wedding. We found a very interesting shell company registered in Preston's name, and we found a direct link to the bank account funding it. Look at the highlighted routing numbers, Pastor. Look at where the money came from. Pastor Gregory's eyes scanned the pages. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. The microphone caught his sharp, jagged intake of breath, broadcasting his panic to the entire church. The documents showed crystal clear, undeniable proof. Jerome Washington, acting in his capacity as the trusted church treasurer, had been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the Grace Temple Building Fund. He had been secretly funneling the congregation's hard-earned donations right into Preston's dummy corporation. That stolen church money was used to pay for the exorbitant leases on Preston's Aston Martin, his luxury sports cars, his custom Rolex collection, and the illusion of wealth my family so desperately craved. Pastor Gregory's hands began to shake violently. He looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto Jerome in the front row with absolute horror and rage. Jerome realized what was happening. He tried to stand up, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, his face turning the color of wet ash as he stared at the ledger on the pulpit. The collective gasp that erupted from the congregation was deafening, a massive wave of shock and fury that completely shattered the sanctity of the room. I simply closed the binder, turned my back on the altar, and walked out of the sanctuary. The heavy oak doors of Grace Temple sealed shut behind me, cutting off the frantic shouts and wailing of the congregation. I did not look back. I stepped into the bright Sunday sunlight, climbed into the back of my waiting car, and instructed my driver to take me to the one place I knew this disaster would inevitably conclude: the Washington family home. By the time Tuesday afternoon rolled around, I was seated in the center of my parents' formal living room. I sat in my mother's prized vintage wingback chair, my posture immaculate, resting my hands on the carved wooden armrests, like a queen presiding over a crumbling court. The visual was striking a stark contrast of absolute control amidst the wreckage of their lives. I was waiting for the final act of this tragic comedy to begin. Despite witnessing her father exposed as a church embezzler and her brother arrested for federal identity theft, Jada simply could not let go of the fantasy. Her desperation to be a wealthy Nantucket wife had completely overridden her basic survival instincts. My security team had flagged the transaction less than 24 hours ago. Jada had taken the last of her personal jewelry and leveraged her car to secure a bailout from a notorious predatory loan shark operating out of the South Side. She had paid Preston's bail. She had actually paid cash to release the man who scammed her family into oblivion. The heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the silent house. Vivian and Jerome were upstairs hiding in their bedroom, refusing to face the world. Jada rushed down the hallway, her face pale and drawn, rushing to answer the door. She still believed Preston was coming to whisk her away. She still believed it was all a terrible misunderstanding. The door swung open, but it was not Preston. It was his parents. Eleanor and Charles Carmichael swept into the Washington foyer, exuding an air of manufactured indignation. They were dressed in what they clearly believed wealthy people wore on a casual Tuesday. Charles wore a stiff tweed jacket that smelled faintly of mothballs, while Eleanor sported a twin-set cardigan and a strand of pearls that clacked loudly against her chest. Jada took a step back, her hands fluttering nervously. "Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael," she stammered, tears immediately springing to her eyes. "Where is Preston? I bailed him out. We need to fix this." Eleanor Carmichael scoffed, adjusting her silk scarf with a dramatic theatrical sigh. She looked around the Washingtons' perfectly decorated middle-class suburban home with blatant, undisguised disgust. "You will not be seeing our son again, you manipulative little climber." Eleanor spat, her voice ringing with a sharp-forced mid-Atlantic accent. "You and your fraudulent family trapped my boy. You promised him a lavish lifestyle, you lured him into this ghetto circus, and when he realized you were completely broke, you had him arrested to save face." Charles stepped forward, pointing a trembling, age-spotted finger at Jada. "You people are all the same," he growled, letting the racist undertone hang heavy and suffocating in the air. "Desperate for proximity to real society, desperate to attach your name to ours. Preston is a victim of your urban scheming. He is currently recovering from the trauma of that holding cell at our family estate, and our lawyers will be contacting you for the emotional distress you have caused our lineage." Jada collapsed against the entryway console, sobbing uncontrollably. She was actually apologizing. She was begging these horrible people for forgiveness, completely broken by the illusion of their superiority. I slowly stood up from the wingback chair. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the hardwood floor drew their attention instantly. I walked out of the formal living room and stepped into the foyer, holding a thick stack of pristine white folders. "Your family estate?" I asked, my voice slicing through Jada's pathetic sobbing. "Is that what we are calling it now?" Eleanor bristled, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. "And who exactly are you to speak to us?" she demanded. "I am the woman who owns everything you see and everything you pretend to be," I replied smoothly. I stopped right in front of them, holding out the first folder. "Take it, Eleanor. Consider it a parting gift." Charles snatched the folder from my hand, his face turning a blotchy shade of crimson. "What is the meaning of this insolence?" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout. "I run background checks on everyone who touches my money," I stated, my eyes locking onto Eleanor's terrified gaze. "And you, Eleanor, were a remarkably easy puzzle to solve. Those pearls around your neck are rented from a theatrical supply company in downtown Boston. That tweed jacket Charles is wearing still has the consignment shop tag tucked inside the inner pocket. You do not have a family estate in Nantucket. You do not even have a summer cottage." I pulled a glossy photograph from my own folder and held it up for Jada to see. "You currently reside in Lot 42 of the Shady Pines Trailer Park outside of Dayton, Ohio." I declared, the absolute truth landing like a physical blow in the foyer. "The property is currently facing foreclosure due to 3 years of unpaid lot fees. You took a Greyhound bus to get here because your 1998 Honda Civic failed its emissions test last month." Eleanor's jaw dropped. The fake aristocratic accent entirely vanished, replaced by a harsh, grating Midwestern twang. "You have no right to look into our personal lives. You stay out of our business." "Your son made it my business the second he tried to steal from my company." I shot back, stepping closer to Charles until he physically cowered. "Preston is not an heir to an old money fortune. His real name is Paul Higgins. He is a serial romance scammer with 2 active warrants in Florida and Texas for wire fraud. He specifically targets insecure, status-obsessed Black families who are so desperate for the validation of proximity to whiteness that they willingly ignore every single red flag. I turned to look at Jada. She was sliding down the wall, her knees giving out completely as the realization finally destroyed her fantasy. "He saw you coming a mile away, Jada," I said, offering no pity, only the cold, hard reality. He knew Mom and Dad would eagerly bankrupt themselves just to brag about their white trust fund son-in-law at the country club. He played all of you perfectly, and you just paid a violent loan shark $40,000 in cash to release a man who is currently on a bus back to Ohio to hide in a tin can. Charles threw the folder onto the ground, his face purple with rage. "You arrogant, stuck-up witch!" he yelled, raising his hand as if he might actually try to strike me. Before his arm could even fully extend, the front door was kicked wide open. My private security detail flooded the porch, stepping smoothly into the foyer. 4 heavily armed men surrounded Charles and Eleanor, forcing them back out onto the front steps. "You have exactly 60 seconds to vacate my property before I have you arrested for trespassing," I said, watching them stumble backward in fear. "And tell Paul that federal marshals are already waiting for him at the Ohio state line." I closed the heavy front door, shutting them out completely. I turned back to the foyer. Jada was curled into a tight ball on the floor, weeping over the shattered pieces of her imaginary crown. I stepped over her, making my way toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. The house was finally quiet. The quiet did not last. If there were a security camera tucked into the high corners of the ceiling, it would have captured the perfect cinematic contrast of the moment. It would have zoomed in on my hands, steady and entirely unbothered, calmly shuffling through the remaining pages of the financial dossiers on the marble counter, while the background of the room exploded into absolute unhinged chaos. The ice clinked softly in my crystal glass as I took a slow sip of water, completely ignoring the frantic scrambling happening behind me. Jada did not stay on the floor. The shock of the trailer park revelation did not snap her back to reality. Instead, the sunk cost fallacy gripped her with a terrifying delusional strength. She pushed herself up from the hardwood, her designer wedding reception dress wrinkled and stained with her own tears. She marched into the kitchen, her eyes wild, her chest heaving with erratic breaths. "I do not care," Jada screamed, slamming her hands down on the marble island just inches from my glass. "I do not care if his name is Paul. I do not care if he is from Ohio. He is my husband. We made vows before God." I slowly lowered my glass, looking at my sister as if she had just sprouted a second head. "You are defending a serial con artist who literally invented a personality to steal from our family," I stated, genuinely marveling at her capacity for self-deception. "He does not love you, Jada. He loved the Washington family credit score." "You ruined it!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "We were happy. He treated me like a queen. You are the one who exposed him. You humiliated me in front of his parents. You took away my future. But you are going to fix it, Nia. You have billions of dollars. You are going to give us $1 million right now." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but her expression remained deadly serious. $1 million, I repeated, testing the absolute absurdity of the words on my tongue. "Yes," Jada demanded, tears of pure entitlement streaming down her face. $1 million to start fresh. We will move to a new city. We will change his name legally. I can still be the wealthy wife I was born to be. You owe me this for destroying my wedding. You have the money. Just write the check and save this family from total public embarrassment." Before I could even process the sheer lunacy of her demand, a new voice chimed in. "She is right, Nia." I turned my head. Vivian had emerged from the hallway, her face a mask of frantic, desperate damage control. My mother had just watched her husband exposed as a church embezzler and her eldest son arrested for federal identity theft. Her entire social kingdom was currently burning to the ground, yet her only concern was the optics of her youngest daughter's marriage. Vivian stepped into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter. "We cannot let the church know about this," my mother hissed. her eyes darting nervously as if the congregation were hiding in my pantry. We cannot let those women in the pews know that the Washington family was scammed by some trailer park white boy. Do you know what they would say? Do you know how they would laugh at us? I will not be the punchline of Grace Temple Ministries. I looked back and forth between the two women who shared my DNA. They were completely irreparably broken by their own vanity. You want me to pay him off? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously low register. You want me to hand $1 million to a wanted fugitive so he will stay married to your daughter as a prop. You want to finance a hostage situation just to keep up appearances at a church that is currently auditing Dad for embezzlement. Yes, Vivian snapped, slamming her hand on the counter in a pathetic attempt to reclaim her maternal authority. You will do it because you are a Washington. We protect our own. We present a united front. Paul can clean himself up. He cleans up very nicely. With $1 million, they can buy a house in a gated community, and nobody ever has to know the truth. You owe this to your sister. You owe this to our family legacy. A laugh bubbled up from deep inside my chest. It started as a soft chuckle and quickly escalated into a genuine, unrestrained laugh that filled the entire penthouse. I laughed until my ribs ached, shaking my head at the two women standing before me. They were standing in the wreckage of their own lies, and their only solution was to demand that I buy them a more expensive lie. I wiped a tear of mirth from the corner of my eye and picked up the last folder from the island. I am not giving you a single dime, I said, the laughter vanishing from my voice, replaced by cold, hard steel. I am not financing your delusions. And frankly, Jada, you are not going to be moving to a gated community anytime soon. You are going to be a little too busy dealing with the federal government. Jada's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice wavering with a new underlying panic. I did not do anything illegal. Trey forged the documents. Dad took the church money. I am innocent. I just bailed my husband out of jail. I opened the folder and slid a printed photograph across the marble counter. It was a surveillance still. It showed Jada standing in a dimly lit parking lot on the south side, handing a thick brown manila envelope full of cash to a man leaning out of a black sedan. You were so desperate to get your fake Prince Charming out of a holding cell, I explained, tapping the photograph with my perfectly manicured fingernail. You realized Dad was broke. You realized Trey was arrested. So you took your engagement ring, your car title, and every piece of jewelry you owned, and you went to a loan shark you found through one of your sketchy club promoters. You handed over $40,000 in cash to secure a predatory bail loan. Jada crossed her arms, lifting her chin defiantly. So what? I did what I had to do for my husband. It is a loan. I will pay it back. You really think a violent loan shark just happens to operate out of a strip mall with a pristine corporate tax record? I asked, leaning in close. You think a guy named Frankie Knuckles just hands out 40 grand without collateral? Vivian looked at the photograph, her face draining of the little color it had left. Nia, who is that man in the car? I smiled, a sharp, lethal expression that offered absolutely no comfort. That is Special Agent Ramirez, I whispered, watching Jada's defiant posture completely collapse. That predatory loan shark operation was a dummy corporation set up by the FBI. I tipped them off months ago when I first traced Paul Higgins' financial footprint. They have been running a sting operation on illicit bail bonds in the city. You did not just bail out a serial scammer, Jada. You willingly engaged in a documented, recorded transaction with a federal trap. You walked right into a money laundering sting. Jada's mouth opened, a silent scream dying in her throat as the room began to spin. The camera shifted, settling into a tight over-the-shoulder tracking shot right behind my head. I was walking up the familiar curved concrete driveway of the Washington family home. 30 days had passed since the foyer incident. 30 agonizing, humiliating days for my parents. With Paul Higgins sitting in federal custody and the FBI actively seizing Jerome Washington's assets as part of the church embezzlement investigation, the financial house of cards had completely collapsed. The legal fees had drained their remaining accounts in a matter of hours. The mortgage on this beautiful, sprawling suburban fortress had gone unpaid for exactly 90 days. What Jerome and Vivian did not know was that I had purchased the debt from their lender weeks ago through a blind trust. I was not just their daughter anymore, I was their sole creditor, and today I was their evictor. Two uniformed sheriff's deputies flanked me, their heavy boots crunching against the fallen autumn leaves. I wore a sharp, tailored black trench coat, my hands resting comfortably in my pockets. We reached the front porch, the same porch where Vivian used to pose for holiday photos to make the neighbors jealous. One of the deputies stepped forward and pounded his fist heavily against the solid oak door. The sound echoed like a judge striking a gavel. We waited in the crisp morning air. I could hear frantic, muffled shuffling from inside the house. The deadbolt clicked. The door was yanked open with violent force. Jerome stood in the doorway, and the sight of him was almost jarring. The impeccably groomed church treasurer was gone. His hair was unkempt, his face covered in graying stubble. He was wearing a wrinkled bathrobe over sweatpants, but the most alarming detail was the wooden baseball bat gripped tightly in his hands. He raised the bat, planting his feet squarely in the center of the doorway. "You are not taking my house," Jerome bellowed, spittle flying from his lips as his eyes darted wildly between the deputies and me. "I built this home with my own two hands. I put the roof over your ungrateful head. You disrespectful, vindictive little snake. You are not taking my kingdom." Vivian hovered in the shadows behind him, clutching the collar of a silk blouse, her face pale and gaunt. She looked absolutely terrified, not of the police, but of the neighbors watching from across the street. The curtain twitching had already begun. "Mr. Washington, please lower the weapon and step aside," the lead deputy said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "We have a court-ordered eviction notice. The property has been foreclosed. You have 10 minutes to gather your immediate personal belongings and vacate the premises." "I am not going anywhere," Jerome screamed, tightening his grip on the bat, his knuckles turning white. "This is my property. I am a respected man in this community. I am a deacon. You think you can just march up here and throw me on the street because my own flesh and blood decided to stab me in the back? I will swing this bat. I swear to God I will swing it." He was unhinged, pushed entirely to the brink by the loss of his status. He still believed his aggressive bluster could intimidate reality away. He still thought he was the man in charge. I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness. Just the cold, clinical observation of a parasite being removed from its host. "You did not build this house, Jerome," I said, my voice cutting through his frantic shouting with effortless precision. "You financed it with stolen money. You leased a life you could not afford, and you used the Congregation of Grace Temple as your personal piggy bank. You are not a king, you are just a thief holding a piece of wood. Step aside." He raised the bat higher, his chest heaving. "I will crack your skull, you ungrateful wretch." Before he could finish his threat, a loud mechanical hiss erupted from the driveway behind me. The heavy grind of diesel gears and the screech of shifting metal interrupted the standoff. Jerome froze, his eyes darting past my shoulder. A massive heavy-duty tow truck had just backed straight up the driveway. The driver, wearing a bright neon vest, had already hopped out and was expertly sliding the steel lifting forks under the front tires of Jerome's pristine, custom-ordered Mercedes-Benz S-Class. The ultimate symbol of his manufactured superiority, the car he had prioritized over my college tuition, the vehicle he polished every Sunday before driving to the church he was actively robbing. "Hey," Jerome screamed, his voice cracking with a sudden desperate panic. "Hey, what are you doing? Get your hands off my car." "That is my car. Your lease is in default." "Mr. Washington," I stated smoothly, not even turning around to look at the tow truck. "The dealership repossessed the title yesterday. I simply gave them the address." The hydraulic lift whined loudly as the front tires of the Mercedes were hoisted off the concrete. "No, no, wait!" Jerome yelled. In a split second, the illusion of his protective rage completely shattered. The house did not matter anymore. The physical shelter over his wife's head was instantly secondary to the preservation of his image. The car was his identity. Jerome dropped the baseball bat. It clattered loudly against the porch floorboards. He shoved past the deputies, completely abandoning the front door, and sprinted barefoot down the driveway toward the tow truck, waving his arms like a madman. "Stop! Put it down! I can get the money. I can make a payment right now," Jerome pleaded, throwing his body against the side of the lifting mechanism, begging the indifferent tow truck driver for a reprieve. The lead deputy did not miss a beat. As soon as Jerome vacated the threshold, the two officers moved swiftly forward. They stepped right over the discarded baseball bat and breached the entryway. Vivian let out a high-pitched shriek, stumbling backward as the deputies ordered her to gather her coat and step outside. "Ma'am, you need to exit the property immediately," the second deputy instructed, guiding a sobbing Vivian out onto the porch. I stood on the walkway, watching the chaotic symphony unfold perfectly. Jerome was on his knees in the driveway, weeping openly as the tow truck driver secured the chains and dragged his beloved Mercedes down the street. Vivian was crying on the front lawn, shivering in the crisp air, trying to hide her face from the neighbors, who were now openly recording the spectacle on their smartphones. The lead deputy pulled the heavy oak door shut. He looped a thick industrial steel chain through the handles and snapped a heavy brass padlock shut with a definitive final click. The Washington family kingdom was officially closed. The camera slowly tilted down from the clear, unforgiving expanse of the autumn sky, descending to frame my perfectly tailored silhouette against the backdrop of total devastation. I stood on the sidewalk, entirely untouched by the hysteria unfolding on the manicured grass. Vivian was on her knees in the front yard. She had managed to drag 2 large Louis Vuitton suitcases onto the lawn before the deputies sealed the house. She was frantically shoving whatever she could reach inside them, weeping hysterically as she folded silk blouses and designer scarves. Her pristine image was gone. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "My castle!" Vivian wailed, her voice cracking as she clutched a decorative silver vase to her chest. 30 years of building this family. 30 years of cultivating our standing in this community, and it is gone. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a toxic, venomous hatred. "You did this. You destroyed your own blood. You let the devil into your heart, and you burned down your mother's kingdom. What am I supposed to tell the prayer circle? What am I supposed to tell the country club?" She was still agonizing over her social calendar. Even now, locked out of her own home, Vivian Washington was only capable of grieving her reputation. I took a slow, measured step onto the grass, the sharp heel of my shoe sinking slightly into the soft earth. I looked down at her with a profound, terrifying emptiness. "It has not been your kingdom for a very long time, Mother," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, resonant authority that immediately silenced her wailing. I turned my gaze away from her pitiful display and looked toward the driveway. Jerome was still standing exactly where the tow truck had left him. He was staring at the empty patch of concrete, his hands trembling at his sides, completely unresponsive to his wife's meltdown. He looked like a hollow shell of the domineering patriarch who used to dictate my worth based on his moods. "I am just curious, Jerome," I called out, my voice slicing through the crisp morning air. "Why did you not just dip into the Bridgewater account to pay the mortgage? You could have easily covered the arrears." The effect was instantaneous. Jerome snapped out of his trance. His head whipped toward me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. "Shut your mouth!" Nia, Jerome barked, taking a sudden aggressive step toward me. His voice was ragged, desperate. "Do not say another word. You have done enough. You have taken my house. You have taken my car. Just leave." Vivian stopped shoving clothes into her suitcase. She looked back and forth between us, wiping a streak of mascara from her chin. "What Bridgewater account?" she asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Jerome, what is she talking about? We do not have any accounts in Bridgewater." Jerome held up his hands, forcing a rigid, unnatural smile as he took a step toward his wife. "It is nothing, Viv. She is just trying to cause more trouble. She is lying. You know how vindictive she is. Let us just gather our things and call a taxi." He reached for her shoulder, but I stepped smoothly between them. "When my forensic accountants were tracking the money you stole from Grace Temple," I explained. Looking directly into Vivian's confused eyes, they found multiple streams of diverted income. We knew you were funneling hundreds of thousands to Paul Higgins to fund Jada's fake lifestyle. But the numbers still did not add up. The church was missing almost double that amount. And then I noticed a discrepancy in your own personal finances, Vivian. Vivian stood up slowly, letting the silver vase drop onto the grass. My finances. Yes, I continued, my tone conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. Half of the income from your boutique, the money you worked 60-hour weeks to earn, has been siphoned off for the last 15 years. Jerome handled the taxes right. Jerome managed the joint accounts. He told you the business was underperforming. He told you the overhead was too high. Jerome lunged forward. I said, shut up! One of the deputies who had been lingering by his patrol car immediately stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Jerome's chest and shoving him back. Step back, sir. Keep your distance, the officer warned. I did not even flinch. I kept my eyes locked on my mother. He did not lose your money, Vivian. He invested it. I revealed, watching the realization begin to dawn in her eyes. He invested it in a lovely 4-bedroom colonial in Bridgewater, just 2 towns over. He bought it under a Shell LLC. He also bought a very sensible Volvo SUV for a woman named Cynthia. Vivian's entire body went rigid. The breath hitched in her throat. Cynthia. Cynthia has 2 children, I stated, delivering the final fatal blow with absolute precision. A boy who is 14 and a girl who is 12. They both have Jerome's eyes. They both go to the prestigious Oakwood Private Academy. Do you know how expensive Oakwood is, Mother? It costs roughly the exact amount of money missing from your boutique profits every single year. The silence that fell over the front lawn was deafening. The chirping of the birds, the distant hum of traffic, even the wind seemed to stop. Jerome has not been working late at the ministry for the last decade and a half. I continued, ensuring every single word landed with maximum impact. He has not been away at spiritual retreats. He has been raising his second family. He used the church tithes to pay for Jada's wedding, but he used your blood, sweat, and tears to pay for Cynthia's mortgage. You were crying over losing your castle, Vivian. But he gave your throne away 15 years ago. Jerome stared at his wife, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Viv, he stammered, raising his trembling hands. Viv, please, I can explain. It was a mistake. Vivian Washington did not speak. She did not cry. The facade of the perfect, poised upper-middle-class socialite completely fractured, revealing a primal, unhinged rage underneath. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream that tore from the very bottom of her lungs. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and humiliation. She threw herself at Jerome with the ferocity of a wild animal. She tackled him onto the manicured grass, her perfectly manicured nails tearing at his face, his clothes, his hair. You stole from me, she shrieked, landing a closed fist squarely against his jaw. You gave my money to some other woman. You let me look like a fool. I gave you everything. Jerome scrambled backward, trying to shield his face as Vivian relentlessly pummeled him right there in the front yard. The 2 sheriff's deputies rushed forward, shouting commands as they struggled to pull my mother off my father. Vivian was thrashing, kicking completely out of her mind with rage, screaming obscenities that she would have previously condemned anyone else for using. The neighbors across the street had stepped entirely out of their houses now. They were standing on their driveways, recording the entire spectacle. The great untouchable Washington family, the pillars of Grace Temple Ministries, were currently brawling in the dirt like common criminals. I stood on the sidewalk, smoothing the front of my trench coat. I watched the deputies wrestle Vivian into the back of a squad car to calm her down, while Jerome lay bleeding and bruised in the grass. The kingdom was not just closed. It was burned to the absolute ground. I turned on my heel and walked toward my waiting car, leaving them to the ashes. I walked out of the sanctuary, leaving the echoing chaos of Grace Temple Ministries behind me to rot in its own hypocrisy. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line, the camera dulled out, slowly pulling back from my composed posture as I sat like a queen on a throne, entirely in control. I had bypassed my own penthouse to wait in the center of the Washington family formal living room. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Jada, crippled by her own desperate vanity and a lifetime of being coddled, had flatly refused to believe that her perfect old-money fiancé was a common criminal. The humiliating spectacle at the church had barely registered through her thick, impenetrable layer of delusion. Instead of cutting her losses and facing reality, she had panicked. She had taken her engagement ring, the title to her car, and leveraged every single asset she had left to a notoriously violent, predatory loan shark operating out of the South Side just to secure the exorbitant cash bail required to release Preston from federal custody. She truly believed that if she just got him out, his non-existent trust fund would magically unlock, clearing his name and saving them all from the scandal. The heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed violently, echoing through the silent, tense house. Vivian and Jerome were upstairs hiding in their bedroom from the catastrophic fallout of the church service, leaving Jada to rush down the hallway. She threw open the door, her face a mask of frantic hope, her makeup smeared from hours of crying. She clearly expected Preston to be standing there ready to whisk her away from this nightmare and into a life of luxury. Instead, she found herself face to face with Eleanor and Charles Carmichael. They swept into the foyer, projecting an aura of furious manufactured indignation. Charles wore a stiff tweed jacket that smelled faintly of damp wool and stale tobacco, while Eleanor clutched a heavily logoed handbag and sported a thick, ostentatious strand of pearls. They looked exactly like what a middle-class person imagined wealthy people looked like on a Tuesday afternoon, a caricature of high society. Jada shrank back, her hands fluttering nervously as she tried to placate them. "Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael," she stammered, tears immediately springing to her eyes. "Where is Preston? I just paid his bail. We are going to fix this terrible misunderstanding." Eleanor scoffed, adjusting her silk scarf with a dramatic theatrical sigh. She looked around the Washingtons' perfectly decorated, meticulously clean suburban home with blatant, undisguised disgust. "You will not be seeing our son again, you manipulative little climber." Eleanor spat, her voice ringing with a sharp, forced mid-Atlantic accent that sounded like it was pulled from a bad vintage movie. "You and your fraudulent family trapped my boy. You promised him a lavish lifestyle, you lured him into this ghetto circus, and when he realized you were completely broke, you had him arrested to save face." Charles stepped forward, pointing a trembling, age-spotted finger at Jada, crowding her personal space. "You people are all the same," he growled, letting the ugly racist undertone hang heavy and suffocating in the air. "Desperate for proximity to real society, desperate to attach your name to ours. Preston is a victim of your urban scheming. He is currently recovering from the trauma of that holding cell at our family estate, and our lawyers will be contacting you for the emotional distress you have caused our lineage." Jada collapsed against the entryway console, sobbing uncontrollably. It was pathetic to witness. She was actually apologizing. She was begging these horrible racist people for forgiveness, completely broken by the illusion of their superiority, willing to take the blame for a crime she was the victim of, just to stay adjacent to their perceived whiteness. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the hardwood floor drew their attention instantly. I walked out of the formal living room and stepped into the foyer, holding a thick stack of pristine white folders. "Your family estate?" I asked, my voice slicing through Jada's pathetic sobbing with effortless, icy precision. "Is that what we are calling it now?" Eleanor bristled, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. "And who exactly are you to speak to us in such a manner?" she demanded, lifting her chin to look down her nose at me. "I am the woman who owns everything you see and everything you pretend to be," I replied smoothly. I stopped right in front of them, holding out the first folder. "Take it, Eleanor. Consider it a parting gift." Charles snatched the folder from my hand, his face turning a blotchy shade of crimson. "What is the meaning of this insolence?" he barked. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout. "I run forensic background checks on everyone who touches my money," I stated, my eyes locking onto Eleanor's suddenly terrified gaze. "And you?" Eleanor were a remarkably easy puzzle to solve. "Those pearls around your neck are rented from a theatrical supply company in downtown Boston." That tweed jacket Charles is wearing still has the consignment shop tag tucked inside the inner pocket. You do not have a family estate in Nantucket. You do not even have a summer cottage. I pulled a glossy photograph from my own folder and held it up for Jada to see. You currently reside in Lot 42 of the Shady Pines Trailer Park outside of Dayton, Ohio. I declared the absolute truth, landing like a physical blow in the foyer. The property is currently facing foreclosure due to 3 years of unpaid lot fees. You took a Greyhound bus to get here because your 1998 Honda Civic failed its emissions test last month. Eleanor's jaw dropped. The fake aristocratic accent entirely vanished, replaced instantly by a harsh, grating Midwestern twang. You have no right to look into our personal lives. You stay out of our business. Your son made it my business the second he tried to steal from my company. I shot back, stepping closer to Charles until he physically cowered, stepping back toward the front door. Preston is not an heir to an old money fortune. His real name is Paul Higgins. He is a serial romance scammer with 2 active warrants in Florida and Texas for wire fraud. He specifically targets insecure, status-obsessed Black families who are so desperate for the validation of proximity to whiteness that they willingly ignore every single glaring red flag. I turned to look at Jada. She was sliding down the wall, her knees giving out completely, as the realization finally destroyed her fantasy. Jada heard everything. She heard the death of her dream and the reality of her nightmare. He saw you coming a mile away. Jada, I said, offering no pity. Only the cold, hard reality of the situation she had forced herself into. He knew Mom and Dad would eagerly bankrupt themselves just to brag about their white trust fund son-in-law at the country club. He played all of you perfectly, and you just gave a violent loan shark everything you had left to bail out a man who does not even exist. The drive to the international terminal took exactly 42 minutes. I watched the sprawling cityscape blur past the tinted windows of my black SUV, the silence in the cabin a stark contrast to the absolute meltdown I had just orchestrated on my parents' front lawn. My phone had been ringing incessantly for the last half hour. Jada's name flashed across the screen over and over again, accompanied by a barrage of frantic, misspelled text messages. Nia, please pick up. He left me. He took my passport and my cash. I am at the airport. Please help me. I did not reply. I simply let the GPS guide me to the departures curb. As my driver pulled the heavy vehicle into the loading zone, I instructed him to keep the engine running and the doors locked. Through the thick bulletproof glass, I spotted her. If Vivian had looked pathetic on the grass, Jada was a complete unmitigated disaster on the airport pavement. She was pacing erratically near Gate 24, shivering in a thin silk blouse that was completely inappropriate for the dropping temperature. Her designer luggage was nowhere to be seen. Her hair, usually sprayed and pinned into immaculate perfection, hung in limp, messy strands around her tear-stained face. She looked like a lost child, entirely stripped of the haughty, entitled arrogance that had defined her entire existence. She spotted my SUV. I watched her eyes widen with a desperate, pathetic flare of hope. She genuinely thought I was there to save her. After years of treating me like a social liability, after actively excluding me from her wedding to protect her fragile, manufactured image, she still possessed the breathtaking audacity to believe I would be her safety net. She sprinted toward the car, her heels clicking frantically against the concrete. She reached the passenger side and yanked hard on the chrome door handle. It did not budge. She yanked it again harder, this time her manicured nails slipping against the metal. Nia, she cried out, pressing her face against the tinted glass, her breath fogging up the window. Nia, open the door. Please. I sat perfectly still in the plush leather seat, watching her panic escalate. I took a slow sip from my bottled water, letting her marinate in the terror of being entirely locked out. Please, I have nothing. He took everything. Jada begged, slapping her palms against the window. My credit cards declined at the ticketing counter. All of them. The bank froze everything because of Dad. When the agent told us, Preston just grabbed my passport and my emergency cash envelope and ran. He literally ran through the security checkpoint and left me. I have absolutely nothing. Open the door. Let me in. She was sobbing openly now, her face contorted in an ugly, snot-nosed wail. The sheer irony of the situation was almost poetic. She was standing exactly where she had tried to put me when she declared me socially unfit for her high society wedding. She had wanted to discard me because I did not fit her aesthetic. Now she was the one discarded, standing on the curb like trash left out for pickup. I tapped the control panel on the armrest. The heavy glass window hummed as it lowered exactly 2 inches, just enough to let the cold airport breeze slip into the climate-controlled cabin. Jada gasped in relief, wedging her fingers into the narrow gap as if she could pry the window down herself. "Oh my God, Naya, thank you. Just pop the lock. We need to call the police. We need to get my money back. I do not even have a way to get home." I did not look at her. I reached into the center console and retrieved a small brown paper lunch bag. I had prepared it earlier, anticipating exactly how this day would end. I turned my head slowly, meeting her frantic, tear-filled eyes, with a gaze so devoid of sympathy, it made her physically recoil from the glass. I slipped the brown paper bag through the 2-inch gap. Jada caught it automatically, her brow furrowing in confusion. She looked down at the bag. I had written on the front of it with a thick black permanent marker. The letters were large and unmistakable. "Limited access, sister. Try an Uber." She stared at the words, her lips parting as the oxygen seemed to leave her lungs. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She remembered the email she had sent me. She remembered the exact phrasing she had used to uninvite me from her wedding because I would embarrass her in front of Preston's fake family. She had called me a limited access family member, someone to be kept hidden away. Inside the bag was a prepaid transit card loaded with exactly $40. Enough to get her on a public bus back to whatever was left of our parents' house. It was $40 more than she deserved, but I have always been generous. "Nia no Jada," whispered, her voice cracking as the full weight of her isolation finally crushed her. "You cannot do this. You are my sister. You cannot leave me here. You made it very clear that I am not fit for your social circle." "Jada," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly detached. "You wanted to play the role of the wealthy, untouchable elite. But the truth is, you are just a broke, gullible mark who fell for a con man. You wanted a luxury life built on lies, and now you get to deal with the reality of being completely bankrupt." I tapped the control panel again. The window hummed as it rolled up, forcing Jada to yank her fingers out of the gap before they were crushed. "Nia, wait. Please," she screamed, slamming her fists against the glass as I signaled my driver to put the car in gear. The heavy SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb. I did not look back. I simply watched the road ahead, leaving my sister standing exactly where she had tried to leave me, sobbing on the airport pavement, completely abandoned in the wreckage of her own arrogance. The grand, imposing double doors of the federal courtroom swung open. The wide, symmetrical shot captured the sheer scale of the room, rich mahogany paneling, towering marble columns, and the stark, intimidating presence of the judge's bench. This was not the chaotic, emotional arena of a suburban front lawn. This was a place of absolute, unfeeling law. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the polished floor. I took a seat in the second row, perfectly positioned behind the prosecution. The defense table was a pathetic portrait of ruined men. Jerome sat rigid, his shoulders slumped inside a cheap, ill-fitting suit that seemed to swallow his previously commanding presence. Trey slouched beside him, bouncing his knee with erratic, nervous energy, the reality of federal prison finally crushing his frat boy arrogance. And then there was Preston, or rather Paul Higgins. Paul. The FBI had caught him less than 48 hours after he abandoned Jada at the airport. He hadn't even made it onto a flight. He was arrested at a dingy motel near the Canadian border, trying to pay a smuggler with Jada's emergency cash. He sat at the far end of the defense table, his fake Ivy League polish entirely stripped away. His hair was greasy, his jaw clenched, and his eyes darted around the courtroom with the frantic, trapped energy of a cornered rat. The bailiff called the court to order. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Carter." A tall, striking African-American woman emerged from chambers, her black robes billowing slightly as she took her seat at the bench. Judge Carter's expression was a mask of cold intellectual steel. She adjusted her glasses, her sharp gaze sweeping over the defendants before briefly, almost imperceptibly meeting my eyes. She was brilliant. She was notoriously strict, and she had been my secret mentor since my first year of business school, quietly guiding my investments and teaching me how to navigate rooms exactly like this one. The prosecution laid out the case with clinical precision. They detailed the systematic embezzlement of Grace Temple Ministries by Jerome Washington. They presented the forged loan documents and wire fraud orchestrated by Trey. And they unveiled the crown jewel of the indictment, the extensive multi-state identity theft and romance scam perpetrated by Paul Higgins, who had targeted the Washingtons as his latest marks. The evidence was insurmountable. There was no defense. There was only the inevitable sentencing. But Paul Higgins was not going down quietly. He shoved his public defender aside and demanded to address the court. Judge Carter, peering over her glasses, granted the request with a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. Paul practically leaped from his chair, gripping the edge of the defense table. The fake aristocratic accent he had used to charm my mother and sister was gone, replaced by a harsh grating and deeply desperate tone. "This is a farce." Paul spat, his face flushing an ugly, mottled red. "I am the victim here. You think I orchestrated this? You think I controlled these people? Look at them." He gestured wildly toward Jerome and Trey. "They are greedy, uncivilized criminals. They dragged me down." The courtroom murmured in shocked disbelief, but Paul was completely unhinged. The mask had fully slipped. "They were so desperate to climb the social ladder they practically threw their daughter at me," he continued, his voice echoing shrilly off the marble walls. "They wanted my perceived status. They wanted to pretend they belonged in a world they could never actually access. I didn't scam them. They tricked me. They used me to prop up their ghetto circus of a family. They are pathetic, classless frauds, and I am being punished for their inherent criminality." His racist, vile rant hung heavy and suffocating in the air. Jerome stared straight ahead, a muscle ticking in his jaw, finally forced to hear the unvarnished truth of what his precious, cultured son-in-law really thought of him. "Mr. Higgins." Judge Carter's voice cut through the room like a crack of thunder. She didn't shout. She simply spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that instantly silenced his frantic pacing. "You are currently standing in a federal courtroom facing multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny across 3 different states," Judge Carter stated, her dark eyes pinning him to the spot. "You preyed upon the insecurities and vulnerabilities of your victims, exploiting their misplaced trust for your own financial gain, and now, in a spectacular display of cowardice, you attempt to shift the blame using language that is as thoroughly disgusting as your crimes." Paul opened his mouth, attempting to interject, but Judge Carter raised a single silencing finger. "I have presided over this bench for 20 years, she continued, her voice resonating with absolute power. "I have seen a vast array of criminals, but rarely have I encountered a defendant so utterly lacking in remorse, so devoid of basic human decency, and so deeply steeped in his own manufactured superiority." She picked up the sentencing report, her gaze shifting to include Jerome and Trey. "Jerome Washington, for the systematic embezzlement of funds from Grace Temple Ministries, funds entrusted to you by a congregation that believed in your integrity, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by full financial restitution." Jerome slumped forward, burying his face in his hands as a quiet sob racked his shoulders. "Trey Washington, for your role in forging financial documents and facilitating wire fraud, I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison." Trey stared blankly at the polished wood table, the reality of his ruined life finally sinking in. Judge Carter then turned her full, unrelenting attention back to Paul. "Paul Higgins," she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling register, "for your extensive history of calculated predatory fraud and your profound inability to accept responsibility for the lives you have actively worked to destroy, I am imposing the maximum penalty allowable by law." Paul staggered backward, his face draining of all color. You are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Judge Carter declared, striking her gavel with a resounding crack that finalized his fate. Court is adjourned. The bailiffs moved in instantly, securing the handcuffs around Paul's wrists as he began to openly weep, his knees buckling under the weight of his sentence. He was dragged away, still blubbering about unfairness, his pathetic cries echoing down the heavy marble corridors. I remained seated, watching the deputies lead my father and brother out through the side doors. They were broken men, stripped of their vanity, their pride, and their freedom. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the wreckage of the Washington family entirely behind me. 6 weeks later, the final piece of debris washed up on my doorstep. I was sitting behind the expansive mahogany desk in my corner office, reviewing the quarterly acquisition reports for my firm. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Boston skyline, a physical representation of the empire I had built entirely without their help. The intercom on my desk chimed with a soft melodic tone. My executive assistant spoke, her voice laced with a rare hint of confusion. She said, "There is a Vivian Washington here to see you, and she refuses to leave the reception area." "Send her in," I instructed, leaning back in my leather chair and folding my hands. The heavy glass doors slid open. A slow, invisible camera push in would have captured the utter magnificent devastation of her face. Vivian Washington, the former undisputed queen of Grace Temple Ministries, looked completely unrecognizable. The designer silk blouses and the perfectly coiffed hair were gone. She was wearing a faded off-the-rack beige sweater that hung loosely on her shrinking frame. Her hair was pulled back into a severe frizzy knot, the gray roots starkly visible against the fading dye. She clutched a cheap faux leather handbag to her chest like a shield. She had absolutely nothing left. Jerome had signed the divorce papers from a holding cell before his transfer to federal prison. Grace Temple Ministries had issued a public statement entirely disavowing the Washington family, permanently banning them from the congregation to salvage their own plunging reputation. The country club had revoked her membership the very morning the FBI seized her bank accounts. Her so-called high society friends had blocked her number and crossed the street when they saw her walking. She was a social pariah, completely destitute and entirely alone. Vivian stopped in the center of my office, staring at the modern art on the walls and the sleek, intimidating expanse of my workspace. She tried to pull her shoulders back, attempting to summon the haughty maternal authority she had weaponized against me for 34 years. "I need a job!" "Nia," Vivian announced, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to sound commanding. "I have lost everything. The bank took the house. The government took the accounts. I am currently sleeping on a cot in the back room of my former nail technician's apartment. I need an income." I did not offer her a seat. I simply watched her, letting the silence stretch until the sheer weight of it made her shift uncomfortably on her feet. "And you came here," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You run a massive corporation," Vivian pressed, taking a tentative step forward. "You have hundreds of employees. I know how to manage people. I ran a successful boutique for over a decade. I organized massive charity galas. I could easily step into a management role here. Director of Public Relations, Regional Operations Manager. Something fitting my experience. I am still your mother, Nia. You owe me that much respect. We are blood. You cannot just leave me with nothing when you have all of this." I actually smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that caused Vivian to instantly recoil. "You did not run a successful boutique, Vivian," I corrected her, my tone clinical and precise. "You managed a failing storefront that was artificially propped up by the money Jerome was stealing from the church. You were a tax write-off for a fraud ring. You have zero actual corporate experience, zero marketable skills, and a public reputation that is currently toxic. If you applied for a job anywhere else in the city, your resume would go straight into the shredder." Tears welled in Vivian's eyes, her lower lip trembling as her manufactured pride finally gave way to pure, unadulterated panic. Please, Naya, I am begging you. I have $40 to my name. I am eating canned soup. I cannot live like this. You have to give me a position. I will do whatever you want. Whatever I want? I repeated, testing the absolute surrender in her words. I stood up from my desk, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the hardwood as I walked over to a utility closet tucked discreetly into the corner of the office. I opened the door and pulled out two items, setting them down on the pristine rug right in front of her feet. A heavy-duty industrial mop and a bright yellow plastic bucket. Vivian stared down at the cleaning supplies, the color rapidly draining from her face. She looked back up at me, her chest heaving. "What is this?" "This is your new position," I stated, gesturing smoothly to the bucket. "At Jada's wedding reception, right before you demanded I pay off a federal fugitive, you told me I was nothing but a low-class, lowly cleaner who did not belong in your high society world. You mocked my work ethic. You mocked the very concept of building something with your own two hands. So today you get to experience the dignity of honest hard work." "Nia, you cannot be serious!" Vivian gasped, taking a horrified step back from the mop as if it were a venomous snake. "I cannot clean floors. I am Vivian Washington. I have arthritis. I cannot be seen pushing a bucket around a corporate hallway. People will laugh at me." "They are already laughing at you, Vivian," I reminded her ruthlessly. "The starting pay is $15 an hour. You get a 30-minute lunch break and zero benefits until you pass your 90-day probationary period. You will clean the bathrooms on the 4th floor, and you will empty the trash bins in the break room. Take it or leave my building right now and go back to sleeping on a cot." She stared at me, searching my face for any hint of mercy, any lingering trace of the desperate daughter who used to beg for her affection. She found absolutely nothing. I was a fortress. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with crushing, inescapable gravity. There were no country club friends coming to save her. Jerome was gone. Trey was gone. Jada was completely bankrupt. I was the only person left in the world who would even open the door for her. Vivian let out a broken, defeated sob. Her shoulders collapsed inward, the last shred of her monstrous vanity dying right there on my office floor. Her shaking hands reached out. Her manicured fingers wrapped slowly around the rough wooden handle of the mop. "Report to the basement level and ask for the janitorial supervisor," I commanded, turning my back on her and walking to my desk. "You are late for your first shift." 3 months later, the final rotting monument to the Washington family delusion was scheduled for the auction block. The camera executed a majestic sweeping crane shot over the sprawling, opulent campus of Grace Temple Ministries. The massive stained glass windows, once a point of arrogant, booming pride for my father, now reflected the bleak, overcast autumn sky. Bright yellow foreclosure tape was plastered aggressively across the heavy hand-carved oak doors, snapping violently in the biting wind. The gold leaf lettering on the marquee out front was peeling, a physical manifestation of the decay within. Jerome and Preston's massive coordinated embezzlement scheme had completely drained the church's extensive coffers, leaving behind tens of millions of dollars in unpaid commercial mortgages, defaulted pension funds, and furious vendor debts. The mighty institution had catastrophically collapsed under the sheer, suffocating weight of its own hypocrisy. But the congregation, willfully blind and desperately clinging to their manufactured status, refused to go quietly into the afternoon. A massive crowd of former members swarmed the front stone steps and the meticulously manicured lawns. They hoisted hastily painted cardboard signs demanding the property be preserved as a place of worship, screaming chants that echoed down the suburban block. They sang aggressive hymns, their voices a discordant, chaotic blend of performative piety and sheer entitlement. Leading the furious mob was the former church executive council, Deacon Hayes, sweating inside a custom-tailored suit that he had undoubtedly purchased with skimmed collection money, was barking into a megaphone. Sister Margaret stood faithfully beside him, clutching her oversized gold-embossed Bible to her chest, her enormous church hat threatening to blow away in the wind. These were the elite inner circle, the very people who had enabled, protected, and cheered on my father's corruption for decades. These were the exact same hypocrites who had judged my tailored business suits, whispered viciously about my demanding career, and blindly worshipped the ground my criminal brother and father walked on. Now they were furious that a faceless corporate holding company had swept in and purchased the foreclosed property at a private sealed bank auction the night before. They demanded an audience with the new buyer. They demanded their stolen sanctuary back. My black armored SUV pulled smoothly up to the curb, flanked seamlessly by two private security vehicles. The aggressive chanting slowly died down, rolling to a halt, as a ripple of confused murmurs spread through the crowd. The mob parted nervously to make way for my driver as he opened my door. I stepped out of the vehicle, the sharp, deliberate click of my designer heels cutting through the sudden heavy silence. I wore a perfectly tailored crimson pantsuit that stood out like a brilliant warning beacon against the dreary gray backdrop of the protest. I did not rush. I walked up the paved concrete walkway with the slow, terrifying confidence of an apex predator inspecting its newly acquired territory. Deacon Hayes shoved his way to the front of the bewildered crowd, his face twisted in a volatile mixture of recognition and immediate visceral disdain. "Nia Washington!" He barked, his voice dropping the megaphone, but still dripping with the same condescending patriarchal authority he had used to scold me when I was a teenager. "What exactly are you doing here? This is a private protest for the faithful standing members of Grace Temple. Your father brought absolute ruin to this holy place, and you have zero business showing your face on these sacred grounds." Sister Margaret nodded fervently beside him, her face pinching into a familiar judgmental scowl. "We are waiting for the new corporate buyers to arrive," Margaret sneered, looking me up and down with undisguised disgust. "We are going to compel them to lease the building back to the true believers. We have legal representation. We do not need the disgraced corporate daughter of a convicted felon loitering around here and making a spectacle of our grief." I stopped at the base of the grand stone staircase, looking up at the furious, entitled faces of the council. I slowly reached into my slim leather briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document securely bound in a navy blue backing. I held it up, letting the cold wind catch the edge of the heavy watermarked paper. "You are not waiting for a faceless corporate entity." "Deacon Hayes," I announced, my voice amplified by the sheer carrying clarity of absolute power. "You are looking at her." A collective echoing gasp rippled through the hundreds of people gathered on the lawn. Sister Margaret dropped her hand from her chest, her jaw physically slacking. Deacon Hayes took a stumbling, uncoordinated step backward, his bluster instantly evaporating into the cold air. "I purchased the Grace Temple Ministries campus in its entirety at 9 o'clock last night." I continued, my gaze locking onto Hayes' suddenly terrified wide eyes. "I paid the commercial bank in cash. $32 million liquidated directly from my personal investment portfolio. I hold the deed free and clear. There is no mortgage. There is no board of directors. There is no executive council. There is only me." "You want to talk about ruin," I said, stepping up the first stone stair, forcing the council members to physically retreat backward up the steps. "My father did not act in a vacuum. Every single one of you on this executive council signed off on those blind, fraudulent financial audits year after year. Every single one of you accepted the generous kickbacks, the luxury retreats, and the VIP treatment, while the collection plates of working-class families were skimmed to fund my family's grotesque vanity. You turned a blind eye to obvious glaring wire fraud because you loved the proximity to power. You are not believers. You are parasites. And this building stopped being holy the exact moment you allowed Jerome Washington to turn it into his personal ATM. "But you cannot take our church away," Sister Margaret shrieked, her voice cracking with raw desperation, abandoning her dignified facade entirely. "It is a house of the Lord. You cannot legally do this." "It is my house now, Margaret," I corrected her with surgical, icy precision. "And it will never be a church again. I have a demolition crew arriving tomorrow morning. I am gutting the main sanctuary. The velvet pews are being sold for scrap wood. The stained glass is coming down. I am converting this entire 70,000 square foot campus into a fully funded free community center and transitional shelter for battered women of color. The crowd fell entirely silent, stunned into absolute paralysis by the magnitude of the shift. The faithful congregation, the ones who had actually been victimized by the council, stopped holding their protest signs, their eyes widening as they listened. I am building a place that actually helps people in the real world, I declared, projecting my voice so every single person on the lawn could hear the death of their old regime. A place that provides job training, childcare, and aggressive legal advocacy for women who are desperately trying to escape the exact kind of toxic, abusive financial control that this church spent decades preaching as gospel. There will be no collection plates passed around here. There will be no required tithes. There will be no elitist patriarchal hierarchies judging people for what they wear or how much they earn. It will be a place of actual refuge, not performative, suffocating piety. I turned my attention back to the trembling, pale members of the former council who were now huddled together on the top step. As for you, I stated, my tone dropping to a cold, unforgiving register that brokered absolutely no debate. You are currently trespassing on private commercial property. You are permanently banned from these grounds. If I ever see Deacon Hayes, Sister Margaret, or any member of the former Grace Temple Executive Board setting foot on this pavement again, my security team has strict, uncompromising instructions to have you arrested and prosecuted to the maximum extent of the law. I did not wait for their response. I did not need to. I turned my back on the sputtering, humiliated hypocrites who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small and insignificant. The camera pulled back into a steady, symmetrical wide shot, projecting the power and absolute law of the moment, perfectly mirroring the justice I had just delivered. I walked up the remaining stone steps, my crimson suit a stark, brilliant line of vibrant authority against the weathered architecture. I pulled a heavy ring of brass keys from my pocket, unlocked the rusted deadbolt, and pushed the massive oak doors wide open. I stepped confidently into the dark, cavernous sanctuary, leaving the toxic remnants of my past outside in the cold, ready to tear down the walls of my father's ruined empire and build something genuinely beautiful in its place. The camera cut abruptly from the quiet, shadowed sanctuary to a gritty ground-level tracking shot violently vibrating with the deafening roar of passing highway traffic. The lens focused tightly on a pair of scuffed, mud-caked work boots, shuffling aggressively along the shoulder of Interstate 95. The oppressive, suffocating heat of the afternoon sun baked the asphalt, creating shimmering waves of distortion in the air. The camera slowly tilted upward, revealing the bright, humiliating neon orange of a mandatory community service jumpsuit. Stenciled across the broad back in stark black lettering were the words, County Department of Corrections. Trey Washington, the former golden child, the arrogant heir apparent, who had spent his entire adult life coasting on stolen church funds and manufactured prestige, drove a sharpened metal spear through a discarded fast food wrapper. He yanked it upward, his face twisting in a grimace of pure, agonizing physical exertion, and shoved the greasy paper into the thick plastic garbage bag he was dragging behind him. He looked absolutely atrocious. The perfectly tailored Italian suits and the smug frat boy grin were entirely gone. His face was covered in a thick layer of grime and sweat, his skin sunburned and peeling from weeks of relentless outdoor labor. His hands, which had never known a single day of actual honest work, were wrapped in cheap canvas gloves to cover the raw, bleeding blisters that covered his palms. Trey had narrowly avoided the devastating federal prison sentence handed down by Judge Carter by making a desperate 11th-hour choice. He had completely turned on his own blood. He had squealed, providing the FBI with the exact ledgers, the hidden offshore accounts, and the encrypted emails they needed to secure Jerome and Preston's airtight convictions. In exchange for betraying his father, Trey had brokered a cowardly plea deal. It kept him out of a concrete cell, but it chained him to a mountain of impossible restitution debt and 10,000 hours of mandatory, highly public community service. He was bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and universally despised by the very social circle he had once ruled. A massive 18-wheeler blew past him, kicking up a violent gust of wind that sent a cloud of grit and toxic exhaust fumes directly into his face. Trey coughed, his eyes watering as he stumbled backward into the dry, weed-choked ditch. He dropped the trash spear, leaning over his knees, trying to catch his breath. He was broken. The reality of his existence, the sheer unyielding daily humiliation of picking up garbage while the city he used to own drove right past him, was actively destroying his mind. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his filthy glove and looked up down the long stretch of highway. That was when he saw it. Approaching smoothly through the shimmering heat waves was a sleek, immaculate black armored SUV. It was gliding down the highway with the quiet, terrifying grace of a shark cutting through water. Trey recognized the vehicle instantly. It was the exact same custom SUV that had routinely pulled up to the country club, the same vehicle that had abandoned his sister at the airport. The SUV slowed its pace as it approached his designated work zone, cruising cleanly along the shoulder line. Through the tinted glass of the passenger window, Trey could see the silhouette of a woman sitting in the plush, climate-controlled interior. It was Nia. She was entirely unbothered, sipping an iced coffee, looking out at the miserable, sweating lineup of community service workers as if they were a passing zoo exhibit. She looked pristine, powerful, and completely untouchable. The sheer blinding contrast between his agonizing degradation and her absolute, effortless supremacy made something inside Trey violently snap. All the jealousy, the bitter resentment, and the furious entitlement that had been brewing inside him for months erupted into a blinding rage. He was the son. He was supposed to be the success story. She was supposed to be the failure. Trey let out a guttural, furious scream. He reached down into the ditch, his gloved hand closing around a heavy, half-full glass soda bottle that had been baking in the sun. He lunged toward the shoulder of the highway, pulling his arm back, and hurled the heavy bottle directly at the passing SUV with every ounce of strength he had left. The bottle struck the reinforced passenger side door with a loud, aggressive thud, shattering instantly. Brown liquid and glass shards exploded outward, raining down onto the pristine black paint. Trey stood on the side of the road, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, glaring at the vehicle, ready for a fight. He wanted her to stop. He wanted her to get out and scream at him. He wanted any excuse to unleash the violent, miserable frustration that was tearing him apart. The heavy SUV braked smoothly, the red taillights flaring bright against the dusty air. It did not swerve. It did not panic. It simply stopped. The vehicle slowly reversed, gliding backward along the shoulder until the passenger side door was perfectly aligned with where Trey was standing in the dirt. Trey braced himself, stepping forward, his jaw set. The tinted window hummed softly, gliding down to reveal the immaculate, freezing interior of the cabin. Nia was sitting comfortably in the leather seat, wearing a flawless white blazer that looked entirely alien in the filthy highway environment. She did not look angry. She did not look frightened. She looked completely, devastatingly bored. She did not raise her voice. She simply picked up her sleek smartphone, held it up, and tapped the screen. The camera flashed, capturing a crisp, high-definition photograph of her brother. The former golden child standing in a ditch wearing a cheap neon orange county corrections uniform covered in sweat and road grime, holding a plastic bag full of highway trash. Trey froze, the flash blinding him for a fraction of a second. The absolute indignity of the moment crushed the remaining fight right out of his body. He knew exactly where that photo was going. It would be circulated to every single person they knew. It was a permanent digital monument to his pathetic downfall. Nia lowered the phone, resting her manicured hand on the edge of the window frame. Her dark eyes locked onto his, stripping away the last ounce of his dignity with effortless precision. "Keep working." Trey, Nia commanded, her voice slicing through the roar of the highway traffic like a scalpel. "My taxes pay for those garbage bags." She did not wait for his response. She tapped the control panel. The window glided silently back up, sealing her away in her untouchable world. The heavy SUV instantly accelerated, the massive tires biting into the asphalt. Trey stood paralyzed on the side of the road as the vehicle surged forward, kicking up a thick, suffocating cloud of dust and hot exhaust fumes directly into his face. He coughed violently, dropping to his knees in the dirt, clutching his chest as he choked on the acrid smoke. He was left entirely alone on the blazing highway, a forgotten prisoner of his own arrogance, forced to pick up the very trash he had once thrown away. The camera executed a slow-motion tracking shot of heavy, relentless rain, violently lashing against the reinforced floor-to-ceiling glass of my downtown penthouse. The city below was entirely swallowed by the fierce, howling storm. The sky had turned a bruised, violent purple, and the streets were rapidly flooding with dark, rushing water. Inside my world was a fortress of absolute silent tranquility. The ambient temperature was perfectly regulated. A fire crackled obediently in the sleek, modern stone hearth. I stood by the glass, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, watching the chaotic weather system unfold far beneath me. I was entirely insulated from the wreckage of the world outside, both meteorologically and personally. The soft, melodic chime of my private security intercom suddenly pierced the quiet room. I glanced at the digital clock resting on the marble console. It was nearly 2 in the morning. I walked over to the security panel mounted seamlessly into the wall and tapped the glowing screen to wake up the exterior cameras. The high-definition night vision feed flared to life, displaying the heavy iron security gates at the street-level entrance of my building. Standing there completely drenched and violently shivering in the freezing downpour were Jada and Vivian. They looked like drowned, miserable ghosts of their former selves. Jada's expensive designer extensions were plastered flat against her skull, her heavy makeup running down her face in dark, muddy tracks. Vivian was clutching a thin, soaked trench coat tightly around her shoulders, her face pale and severely drawn. Her previous haughty arrogance had been completely washed away by the brutal reality of the storm and her own absolute destitution. They were frantically pressing the glowing buzzer, their mouths moving in desperate silent pleas against the howling wind. I pressed the talk button, my finger resting lightly on the cold glass of the screen. Yes, I stated, my voice echoing out into the storm through the external speakers, sounding loud, clear, and completely devoid of emotion. Jada practically lunged at the speaker box, her wet hands slipping on the polished metal casing. Nia, please. You have to let us in. It is freezing out here. The city buses have stopped running for the night. We have absolutely nowhere to go. The downtown shelter is at maximum capacity. Please, Nia, I am begging you. Open the gate. Let us into the lobby. Vivian shoved her way toward the speaker, her voice shaking violently from the cold and the sheer, inescapable degradation of having to beg the daughter she had thrown away. Nia, it is your mother. Please. We are your family. We have lost everything. Jerome is locked away. Trey is doing manual labor on the highway. Grace Temple is gone. We have nothing left to our names. We are freezing to death out here. You cannot leave your own flesh and blood out here in the street like animals. I watched them on the glowing monitor. I searched myself for any lingering trace of pity, any residual guilt, any small fraction of the desperate daughter who used to crave their validation. I found absolutely nothing. There was no vindictive joy, no gloating triumph. There was only the quiet clinical observation of a completed equation. They were experiencing the exact reality they had created for themselves. You are not my family, Vivian, I replied, my tone clinical and precise, cutting through the static of the rain. You are the people who demanded I bankrupt my own company to pay off a federal fugitive in order to protect your manufactured social standing. You are the people who mocked my business, ridiculed my independence, and tried to bleed me dry to save a fraudulent, crumbling empire. You are strangers who happen to share my last name. Jada began to sob hysterically, the terrible sound distorting through the intercom feed. She gripped the metal bars of the gate, shaking them weakly. We have changed, Nia. We promise you we have changed completely. We will do whatever you want. We will work for you. We will scrub your floors. You are the head of the family now. You won. You hold all the cards. We submit to you entirely. Just please do not leave us out here to die in the rain. You are my sister. Blood is thicker than water, Nia. You have to remember that. Blood is thicker than water. I stared at the high-definition screen, watching the two women who had spent 34 years treating me like an expendable second-class asset, now groveling for their very survival. They were not genuinely sorry for what they had done to me, to the church congregation, or to themselves. They were only sorry that they had lost their power. They were parasites desperately looking for a new host to latch onto, seeking the warmth and security of the empire I had built entirely without their help. My doors were permanently closed. I leaned closer to the microphone, my voice dropping to a calm, terrifying whisper that cut through the raging storm with absolute finality. Blood is thicker than water. I agreed, slowly measuring every single syllable. But peace is thicker than blood. I pulled my finger back and pressed the master override switch. A sharp electronic click echoed loudly through the penthouse. I permanently disabled the exterior intercom feed, severing the audio connection entirely. I tapped the security protocol icon, placing the entire building into full lockdown, ensuring that my private guards would physically remove anyone loitering near the perimeter gates. The security screen faded to a silent, deep black. I turned my back on the panel and walked slowly toward the fireplace, the muffled sound of the rain against the thick glass washing away the last dying echoes of the Washington family. The tracking shot that had followed me across the quiet, shadowed expanse of the penthouse finally slowed its mechanical glide, coming to a smooth, deliberate rest. The lens drifted to a dead, perfectly centered halt. I turned slowly from the warmth of the crackling hearth and looked directly into the camera. There was no anger left in my eyes, no lingering sorrow, and absolutely no regret. The turbulent, raging storm outside was a fitting end, a violent meteorological cleansing that had washed the slate completely clean. The heavy, suffocating book of the Washington family had finally been slammed shut, and I was the only one left holding the pen. The dark rain-swept glass of the penthouse faded, dissolving into brilliant, blinding morning sunlight. The former Grace Temple Ministries campus was entirely unrecognizable. The oppressive stained glass vanity and the heavy gilded altars of my father's fraudulent empire were gone. The space had been gutted and reborn, transformed into a sprawling modern sanctuary of actual salvation. Massive clear windows flooded the expansive rooms with natural light, illuminating sleek collaborative workstations and vibrant open-concept counseling offices. I walked through the bustling, energized corridors, not as a conquering tyrant demanding submission, but as an architect of genuine empowerment. I stopped in the main atrium, handing a thick envelope of legal documents and a fresh set of apartment keys to a young, terrified mother whose bruised face was finally relaxing into a hesitant, beautiful smile. All around me, women of color. Women who had been marginalized, abused, and financially trapped by the very patriarchal systems my family had so ruthlessly upheld were reclaiming their lives. They sat in financial literacy seminars, consulted with aggressive top-tier pro bono attorneys, and watched their children play safely in the state-of-the-art, fully funded daycare center. There was no judgment here. There was no collection plate passed around to fund a pastor's private jet. There was no elitist hierarchy dictating their worth. There was only upward mobility, fierce, uncompromising protection, and the tangible, breathing reality of a community actually healing itself. The scene smashed cleanly to the high-altitude, rarefied atmosphere of my corporate boardroom. I sat at the head of a massive, polished obsidian table surrounded by industry titans and elite venture capitalists. I was no longer the dismissed invisible daughter forced to wear dull, unassuming colors to avoid outshining her fraudulent brother or offending her mother's fragile ego. I wore a sharp, immaculate emerald green blazer, confidently reviewing the final terms of a monumental, multi-million-dollar international acquisition. My firm had tripled in valuation. My investment portfolio was entirely bulletproof. I signed my name at the bottom of the contract with a smooth, decisive stroke of my pen, and the room erupted in genuine earned applause. I had built this empire brick by brick, late night by late night, without a single cent of stolen church money or a single ounce of high society nepotism. I commanded the room not through fear, religious manipulation, or manufactured pedigree, but through undeniable sheer competence. The harsh, bright fluorescent lights of the corporate boardroom dissolved into the warm, golden, flickering ambiance of a private dinner party. My expansive dining room was filled with the rich, melodic sound of overlapping laughter, the clinking of crystal wine glasses, and the smell of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. I sat at the center of a long, rustic oak table surrounded by my chosen family. These were the mentors who had guided my career, the fiercely loyal colleagues who had stood by me when my reputation was under public attack, and the deep, abiding friends who had loved me when I had absolutely nothing to offer them but my authentic self. There was no performative, booming prayer before the meal. There was no rigid, suffocating etiquette designed to mask deep-seated, rotting dysfunction. There were no snide, passive-aggressive comments about my marital status, my weight, or my career choices. No one was competing for the spotlight. As I looked down the table, watching the people I loved sharing stories and passing plates of food, a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settled deep into my bones. For 34 long, agonizing years, I had carried the heavy, crushing burden of a daughter desperately seeking her mother's approval and her father's pride. I had contorted myself into shapes that did not fit, silenced my own voice, and starved my own ambitions, all for the faint, pathetic hope of earning a love that was fundamentally conditional. I had wanted the Washington family to see me, to validate me, to finally admit that I was worthy of occupying the same space as them. But looking around my glowing dining room, the final jagged pieces of my internal conflict seamlessly snapped into place. I did not need their validation. Their love was a toxic counterfeit currency, and I was finally wonderfully bankrupt of the desire to earn it. The phantom ache of the family I wished I had was entirely permanently replaced by the magnificent reality of the life I had built with my own two hands. The wound had closed. The scar was just a reminder of what I had survived. The vibrant, joyous scenes of my new reality slowly faded away, bringing the focus sharply back to the quiet, fire-lit penthouse. The camera remained locked in that dead, perfectly centered halt, framing my face in sharp relief against the dancing shadows of the room. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence across the city skyline. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute, unyielding certainty of my victory settle into my posture. I looked directly through the lens, piercing the veil, holding the gaze of anyone who had ever been told they were not enough. They handed me a brown paper bag to keep me hidden in the shadows. I said, my voice steady, resonant, and echoing with an unyielding, absolute truth. They didn't realize that in the dark, you don't need status to see, you just need vision. I didn't destroy my family. I just handed them the mirror they spent their whole lives running away from. A slow, brilliant, triumphant smile spread across my face, illuminating the dark room with the sheer, undeniable force of a woman who had finally unequivocally set herself free. The image held for a breathless, perfect moment, cementing the empire I had claimed before the camera, slowly, inevitably faded to a deep, absolute black.